Now, Nigel Lawson, the Chancellor who spearheaded Margaret Thatcher's privatisation and tax-cutting agenda, has passed away at the age of 91. Tributes have poured in for him, including from the Prime Minister, who said he's an inspiration to me and many others.
And former PM Boris Johnson said he was a fearless and original flame of free market conservatism.
Well, one man who remembers Nigel Lawson personally, because he worked very closely with him, is the former Chancellor of the Exchequer, Lord Lamont, who joins us now. Lord Lamont, good morning to you. Nigel Lawson is often described as one of the most consequential of the post-war Chancellors. Why so?
Well, I think he had a huge impact on the whole period, beginning and end, of Mrs Thatcher's government. He worked at the beginning very closely with her in opposition, helping to develop the policies that were going to bring inflation sharply down, the so-called monetarist policies, reducing the deficit, preparing for government. That was the first phase. Then he was in the Treasury with Geoffrey Howe implementing those plans. Then he became involved in the privatisation plans in the mid-80s. He was one of the architects of that. Then he went back to the Treasury and became Chancellor of the Exchequer and reduced the size of the public sector, implemented a tax-cutting agenda. So almost everything that you associate economically with Mrs Thatcher, he had a huge impact on.
Of course, was very responsible for the transformation in the stock market called Big Bang, deregulation of the stock exchange, which even today, Lord Lamont, means the London Square Mile is one of the most significant in the world.
Yes, I think also there were other people involved in that as well, Cecil Parkinson, but you're quite right. Nigel Lawson believed that it was right to open up the City of London to international investment and international competition, something that was resisted by the old guard in the city, but proved to be beneficial to the city in the long run.
91 is a wonderful age. Many of us would like to get to 91. What was he like as a person? Did he enjoy life?
Very much so. Nigel, there were many, many sides to him. He had a great sense of humour. I remember going to, I think it was his 80th birthday party, where he donned a velvet jacket and pretended to be Noel Coward, singing Noel Coward songs. You could hardly have believed it. I also remember I was in competition with him to get the seat of Blaby in Leicestershire. He won and he got the seat. I was left high and dry. But I actually subsequently got a seat in a by-election so that I got into the House of Commons before Nigel, even though he'd beaten me for Blaby. But he wrote me a charming postcard just saying, "Delighted to have done you such a good turn." Showed his sense of humour.
Is it true, Lord Lamont, you'll know this story, or is it just apocryphal? When he became Chancellor, Mrs Thatcher had one difficult task to confront with him when she said, "Nigel, you have to have your hair cut."
That's quite possible. He did look like the Prince Regent, really, at one point, long flowing hair. He put on a lot of weight, Nigel, at one point, but typically with Nigel, he then decided to lose it and he went on a great diet, and then he wrote a book on slimming and how to lose weight, which was a bit of a bestseller. He could turn his hand to many things, and as you remember, he subsequently got very involved in the debates about climate change. So he wasn't a person just interested in finance and nothing but finance.
Let me take you to the 1988 budget, though, because there are parallels with what Liz Truss tried to do last year, Lord Lamont. It was probably the most emblematic budget of the Thatcher years. He cut the top rate of tax from 60p in the pound to 40p. Income tax was cut, the lower rate was cut from 27 to 25p. It caused such uproar on the Labour benches, as I recall. The Speaker had to shut the Commons down for 10 minutes.
Yes, that's right. Well, it was extremely radical, but of course most of the tax cuts have endured, and even Labour governments didn't dare to put them up to what they were previously. Remember, when the Conservative government started off in 1979, the tax on unearned income was 98%, and that was cut by Geoffrey Howe with the backing of Nigel. But that was the great agenda of the 80s.
We've got the highest tax burden at the moment that we've had for 70 years in this country. Can I just ask your personal opinion on on whether you think that is a sensible way to be running the economy at the moment, with your vast experience behind you?
Well, of course, as a Conservative, I don't like having a high tax burden, the highest since the 1940s. That is true. But that is true of an awful lot of countries in the world. The pandemic put up public spending in G7 countries by an average of 4% of GDP. So everybody has had this massive expenditure, and you will find the tax burden is rising throughout Europe and throughout the G7. 2 years ago, I'm not sure what the figures are today, because we don't know exactly what every country is doing, but 2 years ago, the gap between us and the average in the G7 was 4%. We were 4% lower in the tax burden, 7% lower compared with the EU 12, that is the original 12 members of the EU. So, Britain has seen its tax burden rise, but that is happening all over the world because of the effects of COVID. These aren't just excuses being made by the present Conservative government. It's a fact that the debts that were incurred have put up the indebtedness of the country and caused every country problems.
Can I ask you just finally,
But of
Lord
course,
Lamont...
I want to cut taxes in the long run.
Yeah. Just finally, Lord Lamont, Nigel Lawson and Mrs Thatcher had that incredibly close working relationship, but in 1989, was it shortly after she said he was unassailable, he resigned from the Cabinet because they fell out over a number of issues. Is that what always happens between Chancellors of the Exchequer and Prime Ministers? Because you had one or two issues with your own Prime Minister when you were Chancellor, of course, in John Major.
Well, the fact that the Chancellor of the Exchequer lives next door to the Prime Minister and there's just a connecting door between them, you'd have thought they could manage to get on, but actually there's always a bit of a strain. I think even Prime Ministers who've been Chancellor of the Exchequer before tend to become more political because they're interested in elections, interested obviously in getting back to power. They're more nervous about electoral consequences, whereas the poor old Chancellor is the only person who wants to restrain expenditure, keep taxes down, and be responsible. And unless the Prime Minister and the Chancellor work very close together, the Chancellor is completely powerless. But there's an inbuilt tension there. I did try very strongly to persuade Nigel not to resign. I was very, very sad when he did. I wrote him a letter on the day saying, for goodness sake, don't do this.
Pity you didn't listen, Lord Lamont.
Sorry?
It's a pity you didn't listen.
Indeed, yes.
All right. Thank you so much for joining us. That's Lord Lamont, the former Chancellor of the Exchequer, talking about his friend and former colleague, Nigel Lawson, Lord Lawson of Blaby, who has died at the age of 91, one of the great post-war reforming Chancellors.
Yeah, like Tony Buxton was saying, it feels like a sort of end of an era, doesn't it, when all of those particular protagonists start to shuffle off this mortal coil. But Rishi Sunak said, one of the first things I did as Chancellor was hang a picture of Nigel Lawson above my desk. Do you believe that?
Sounds good today, doesn't it?
He said he was a transformational Chancellor and an inspiration to me and many others. My thoughts are with his family and friends at this time.
And we shouldn't forget Nigel Lawson had 6 children. Dominic is a very famous journalist, and Nigella, of course, is a very famous cookery writer.
Absolutely.